Listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Hello, and welcome to today's Policy in Practice webinar. My name is Janet Harkin, and I'm delighted to welcome so many of you here today. The webinar today is titled Designing Your Best Fit Council Tax Reduction Scheme. Okay. So before we start, and just while we're waiting for a couple more people to join us, I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping with you, if I may. First of all, please raise your digital hand in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen and give me a little wave so that I know that you can hear me. And while you're doing that, if I could also point you to, in the same panel, you'll see the option to ask a question via the question mark icon. So throughout the webinar, please pop your questions in here for our speakers at any time, and there'll be points throughout the webinar where we'll be asking questions to the speakers. Thank you, people, for give me a wave. We'll be asking you for your views in a couple of polls and a survey at the end of the webinar, and we do aim to finish by 11:30, and we will send you a recording of the webinar plus all of these slides afterwards. Okay, so thank you. I think you can all hear me. So without further ado, let me talk to you and introduce you to our speakers. You can see their faces here on the screens. Zoe Charlesworth is a Product and Policy Manager for Policy and Practice. She's worked in the field of revenues and benefits since 1985, and for many years as the Benefits Manager for Reading Borough Council and the Vale of Whitehorse District Council. She was also Principal Benefits Training Manager at London Borough of Lambeth. Zoe is also a Director of the Welfare Reform Club and has led on all of our recent CTRS analysis projects and can talk about any of these with you. Giovanni Tonuti is a Senior Policy and Operations Analyst for Policy and Practice. He joined us because he's fascinated by the application of data analysis to the field of social policy. And he's worked on over 15 local authority projects to understand the cumulative and aggregate impact of welfare policy on individual households, often working with data sets from multi-agency sources to do so. Giovanni has led all of our analysis on our recent projects. He's also a skilled linguist, speaks English, Italian and Spanish, and loves cycling and playing football. And then moving on to our guest speaker, who we're delighted to welcome today. Steve Hill is the Head of Benefits and Services for London Borough of Tower Hamlets. He's worked for Tower Hamlets within the Benefits Service for 26 years and counting, he says. Prior to this, Steve worked for the Department of Work and Pensions for 9 years. This is back when DWP were known as the DHSS, and supplementary benefit included housing costs. Steve was born, grew up and went to school in Tower Hamlets and now lives in Essex. But despite his East End connections, he supports the only team in London to win the European Cup. So without, you can make of that what you will. Onto the agenda then, before I hand over to Steve. So what we're going to be talking through today, I'm going to introduce Policy and Practice very quickly to you for those of you who don't know us. And then I shall be handing over to Steve, who's going to tell us about London Borough of Tower Hamlets scheme. And Giovanni will then then Zoe's going to talk about the context, the bigger picture for CTRS. And then Giovanni's going to talk about our approach, how we model CTRS options, and then questions and next steps. So as I say, plenty of opportunity for questions throughout. So please do pop them into the panel on your right-hand side there. So let me tell you a little bit about Policy and Practice. I mean, many of you may already know us, but our mission is to make the welfare system simple to understand so that people can make the decisions that are right for them. Policy and Practice, we're made up of a team of policy experts led by one of the architects of Universal Credit, Devon Galani. We believe the welfare system can be delivered more effectively, and we help people towards greater financial independence if it is simple for people and organisations to understand. Our software helps people on low incomes to understand how government policy affects them so they can make those decisions, those informed decisions. Our analysis shows how each individual household is affected by all policy changes now and in the future. And this helps local authorities to target resources, meet their statutory obligations and to spend their money more effectively. Using our software engine, we model how the policies of 4 government departments affect thousands of individuals on low incomes. And today we'll show you how we take a data set that's common to all local authorities and model options for council tax reduction schemes. We use a scientific approach to data visualisation that can drill down to individual households and help people to take back control. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over now to Steve, and he's going to take you through his experiences at Tower Hamlets. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Janet. Well, first of all, start with the challenges for Tower Hamlets and designing our local council tax reduction scheme. From April 2013, Tower Hamlets adopted a 100% scheme which mirrored the previous National Council Tax Benefit scheme. We protected war widows, and from April 2013 we reviewed our scheme annually, and the appetite was very much that we should continue with that line of approach. However, there's been quite a few changes in Tower Hamlets in the past few years. Government intervention saw commissioners being sent to Tower Hamlets. I hasten to add that benefits was not an area of concern for the commissioners. But as a result of that government intervention, a mayoral election followed. We had an appointment of a new mayor, a new administration, and subsequently a new senior management team. And as a consequence of that, there was a new focus on best value and value for money. And whilst all this was going on, of course, the government budget reductions, which basically are impacting all local authorities, were such that Tower Hamlets felt that we had to find around £52 million during the course of the next 3 years. Last year, full council decided to review our local council tax reduction scheme in 2016-17 and take into account the impact of welfare reform. So it wasn't just a question of reviewing the scheme, it was also reviewing the scheme in the light of welfare reform and the impact on the borough. But clearly the need for savings was running parallel to that review, and as I'm sure is the case with everybody on the line, benefits are not exempt from the need to reduce costs. Having said that, the challenge for us is that we are one of the most deprived boroughs in the country. Welfare reforms are having a substantial impact on our caseload. We have around 1,000 overall benefit capped cases. We have 2,000 bedroom tax cases. We have universal credit for single claimants been rolled out. I'm sure it may be similar with other authorities, but we've had major issues on those universal credit cases, and that causes us concern, particularly as going forward in February and March we have full universal credit digital going live in Tower Hamlets as well. So basically I hope that paints a picture that we've got a lot of challenge in relation to welfare reform and obviously a lot of change going on. So bearing in mind that review, why did we go with policy in practice? Well, we needed help. We didn't just want to basically run the reports and the detail ourselves. We felt that we need an independent analysis that actually goes into detail behind the figures, so that our members could make an informed decision on change. So we went out to tender. And of all the tenders that came forward, policy and practice stood out, and that's because of their team, their CVs, their experience and knowledge. It speaks for itself. We were particularly impressed, I have to say, with Paul Howarth being part of their team. We had previously worked with Paul in the past when he was at DWP, and obviously his knowledge is second to none where housing benefit is concerned. But the team overall was just basically come across as being, a promise of extremely high quality work. The other thing that we also noticed from the tender is that they'd proven experience of turning around information quickly. And then when you looked at the approach was to actually use our Shuby data. And basically using the Shuby data, use that to basically inform the overall analysis. So given that quality insurance was the key, we went with policy in practice. Effectively, we met with them, we explained our requirements. What we did is we agreed on 5 schemes. The first was calculate council tax reduction as we do now, but reduce the result by 80%. The second was council tax reduction is calculated as now, but then the base is based on 80% liability. And the third option was an income banded model under universal credit. And then what we did is we did council tax reduction calculated as now, but reduced by 80% with protection for vulnerable households, and council tax reduction as it is now, but reduced the base of 80% liability, again with protection for vulnerable households. What we wanted to know is what were the impact on the number of households affected, what the potential cost reduction would be if we were to adopt each scheme, and of course, very, very key to us, what are the welfare reform impacts in detail in respect of the changes that we were proposing. What Policy and Practice also offered was a review on admin costs. So what our admin costs would be were we to choose any one of those 5 schemes. So that was a very, very good starting point, and I have to say Policy and Practice delivered that information and in good time. Following receipt of that information, what we then did is we went out to full consultation. We were a little bit worried about the amount of time we actually had, but our legal service basically reassured us that the key was ensuring that everybody was notified and everybody had the opportunity to respond. So our full consultation actually took place from the 14th of October to the 2nd of December. We wrote to all households. The actual consultation was done on a web-based questionnaire. The good news is we had a really high response rate. We had 2,092 responses. We also had a petition that was signed by over 500 residents, and we also had representations from the Child Poverty Action Group, Toynbee Hall, and the GLA, as well as others. So it was quite a comprehensive consultation, and we were really, really pleased at the response rates. The feedback from the consultation was fairly even across all of the options. There was no one favoured scheme, and there was broadly even support for each, although I would say that 46% of residents were in favour of changing the scheme, whilst 40% thought we should keep the current local council tax reduction scheme. So, armed with that information, we met with the Mayor and lead members, and we had some detailed discussions in terms of the direction of travel that they would prefer. And what was decided upon was that we would focus on elements of the scheme that we had consulted upon. And I'll talk about those elements in a moment, but that sent us into a little bit of a panic, because we knew that if we were going to do that, we'd need further modelling. And this was late December, and we need this for a January cabinet. So once again, we picked up the phone to Policy and Practice, and I have to say within days they'd turned the analysis around for us. They'd ran the options and the impact analysis, and we focused on 4 elements which members wanted us to focus. So the first one was that all household income would be taken into account. The second was that a new non-dependent deductions for working age households with a cut-off at £370.50. That is, if you have a non-dependent who receives £370.50, there would be no entitlement to council tax reduction. And that £370.50 is the London living wage times 38 hours, which is what members wanted us to focus on. The next one was self-employed earnings and earning below minimum wage. And there was a proposal that we assume minimum wage where for the second year of self-employment, self-employment is not basically hitting at least minimum wage levels. Basically, we're looking at genuine and effective employment there. And the final one was what would happen if we reduced our capital limit from 16k to 6k. With that detailed analysis that Policy and Practice turned around in record time, we were able to go to Cabinet. Cabinet's view was that we should retain our 100% scheme, but to make changes to include the new non-dependent deductions and the cut-off at £370.50, not to include all household income being taken into account, to look at the self-employed minimum income change, and to look at reducing savings to £6,000. We also had agreement to align housing benefit changes on backdating and going abroad. Now, we wrote the Cabinet report for Cabinet for the 10th of January. I'm not bigging up policy and practice here, but I have to say, without that late analysis, I think we would have been struggling, simply because I don't think members would have been able to make the informed decision. But members were happy that these proposals actually continue to protect low-income households in Tower Hamlets. We went to full council on the 18th of January, where the scheme was approved. So the scheme, whilst protecting low-income households, also basically reduces our scheme costs by about 1.7 million a year. Now what we're doing is we are in the process of agreeing the software changes that are required to our core assessment processing system. We need to train our staff, of course, and then we need to go through the annual uprating process, and then we're good to go. So that basically was the Tower Hamlets journey and how we got to where we are. But as a result of the work that we've done, we have a scheme that members are happy with, that they think protects low-income households in Tower Hamlets, whilst at the same time does basically generate cost savings in the region of 1.7 million per year. Back to you, Janet.
Very interesting, Steve. Very interesting. I'm conscious of your time, because I know that you have to shoot off for a meeting with the Mayor anytime soon. But before you do that, Steve, if I could just ask a couple of questions that have come in. Is there anything, given your experiences that you just outlined to us, is there anything that you would have done differently, do you think?
I think, obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, a longer run-up would definitely be required. This is the first time that we've actually had to change our scheme, so I appreciate we're playing catch-up with a lot of other local authorities. I think what we'd like to do in future is we'd like to basically meet with the Mayor and key members at a very, very early stage and run through all the potential options and try and ascertain very early what is on the table in relation to changes and what is off the table as well. So we get members buying on the options at a very early stage. The other thing I'd have to say is that whilst our consultation responses was really good and really high, our consultation itself, the feedback we've had is that members of the public found that complex. It is a complex area, we appreciate that, but I think if we could do something differently, then it would probably be to have more time on putting the consultation questions together to make it as easy as possible. But nevertheless, it did do the job, and certainly, you know, from the feedback that we got, there's a high level of confidence with regard to that. But they're the sort of things I'd do differently.
And any advice then for other people, any that you'd give to other local authorities?
I think one of the big issues for us is that we're doing the day job, and whilst doing the day job, and obviously doing that day job with reduced resources, it's good to have organisations like Party and Practice to call upon when you're up against it. I appreciate it is an issue of cost, but in relation to cost and benefits, if members are making informed decisions based on fact and data that's basically generated from your own system, they're going to be more confident in making that decision. And if you have the option and you have the finance available to basically go and get some consultative help, then I think that's definitely worthwhile. I think that's certainly the route we'd take in future. And the cost benefits, I think, speak for themselves.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Steve. Like I say, I'm conscious you have to shoot off, and any other questions that come through from any attendees throughout the webinar, we'll be sure to put them to Steve, and I'm sure he'll be delighted to give us some feedback offline, and we can send that on to people. Steve, thank you so much for your time. Very interesting experiences there.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
No problem.
And while Steve heads off, it's over to my colleague Zoe, who's going to pick up her part of the presentation. Over to you, Zoe.
Hello everybody. I'm going to start by looking at the context for the modelling of CTRS schemes. It was really interesting to hear Steve's experience, but this is within a context that all local authorities are facing, and it obviously starts from when policy for council tax support was devolved from central government to local authorities, and alongside this it was part of the localism agenda. So alongside this there were cuts in funding to local authorities and the expectation that local authorities would take more of a role in support and the financial support for council tax within their area as well as other services. The welfare support was also being, at the time, there was an idea that welfare would move more towards local authorities, and we saw this with discretionary housing payments. We also saw the social fund being partially moved to local authorities as local welfare assistance, although of course when that moved to DCLG it was funding for that was stopped. But we also saw a move to local authorities being crucial in the move to universal credit, providing support to people through the transition, but also ongoing support to people who were managing their claims or having difficulty managing their claims. So when local authorities were first looking at developing CTRS schemes, they started with a 10% cut at the outset, and at that point the funding for CTRS was separately identifiable within the settlement grant. That's no longer the case. It's been rolled into other funding. So it's very tricky now to look at to actually identify the amount of funding that a local authority has. There was a very interesting report done by the LGA that looked at cuts overall to local authorities, and their prediction is that by this year the reduction in support for CTRS schemes is 28% less than when these schemes were first devolved to local authorities. This means that local authorities have got very cash limited schemes within quite tight budgets, and behind all of this there is a move towards universal credit, the rollout of universal credit, and local authorities moving to full service. And local authorities were setting their council tax schemes initially with this in the background. Most understood that at some point in the future they would have to move to making schemes that fitted alongside universal credit and made the admin savings that would be necessary, because the additional work required to assess a council tax scheme on top of a housing benefits scheme is minimal, and I think the admin grant that local authorities get for that is only about £11 per claim. But the DWP did some very interesting work quite a few years ago now, looking at the total cost of a standalone claim. They were looking at housing and benefit claim, but it would be the same for a council tax claim if their schemes just stayed based on the default or the old council tax benefit schemes. And they came up with a figure of £267 a claim, which really, if you look at the cost of housing benefit, the percentage cost in admin is low. Once you've moved housing over to universal credit, the percentage of cost on administration for just a council tax benefit, council tax reduction scheme can be up to 30% of the scheme, of the total costs. So local authorities were very aware that at some point in the future, as the housing support moved to universal credit, they might need to make quite radical changes to schemes. Initially though, most developed schemes that were based on the old council tax benefit or default schemes. And if we move to the next slide, we can see that the schemes initially are they're all sort of based on, they're tinkering around the edges with the previous schemes. And there's been very little change from 1314 to 1516. The majority of authorities just went with a minimum payment. Some innovation was introduced with band caps, changing the income tapers, but even with these innovations, these are still based on the old council tax benefits scheme, and so they would still take just as much administration as previous schemes. And I think we've now reached a point with universal credit closer for some authorities, actually in full service for others, where local authorities, the impetus for moving to more complex schemes, or in particular schemes that work very well with universal credit, and take the admin of assessment of needs against income away from local authorities and leave that burden with the DWP under the universal credit assessment. It makes more sense now to have quite a radical look at schemes. And we're finding in policy and practice that there's a snowballing effect in local authorities wanting models. Those who aren't planning to change schemes immediately, a lot of them are thinking about it. They're aware that this change would make sense to them at this point. So I've got a quick poll now, and it's just asking if you're thinking about changing your current CTR scheme. So I'll leave that. I'll pass over to Janet to manage that.
Lovely, thank you. So I'm just about to launch the poll now. Hopefully you can see that on your screen and you can start voting. So what we're asking is, are you planning to change your own CTR scheme? And the answers, I can see you're all coming in. Some of you, yes, for 2017 to 18, so that's this next year coming up. Yes, for 2018 to 19, the following year. Yes, for after 2018-19. Yes, but I don't know when, and if you don't know at all. Thank you very much, everybody who's voting. I'll just give you a few more seconds. I think most people seem to have voted now. Thank you so much. So let me just close that poll, and I can share the page with you, and you can see how everybody's voted. Zoe, any comments on those results?
Yeah, obviously the majority of people are actively looking at amending their schemes and making changes to their schemes. It'd be very interesting to know actually if this aligns with full service universal credit in the areas. There's quite a lot going for 18-19, but actually I'm quite surprised by 36% not knowing when they're going to change their CTR scheme. Yeah, I'd actually it would be interesting to look at the results in relation to when those areas are moving to universal credit. Do you have any comments, Giovanni?
Well, I think following on from what Steve said, I think, you know, the suggestion I have for all those local authority planning to change the scheme for 2018, 2019 is to act on time, because, yeah, I think what we learn also from the experience at Tower Hamlets is that the whole process can take a lot longer than initially expected. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
Janet.
I shall hide that poll and then move on to the next slide. It's coming up now. Zoe.
Yeah, I just want to look at some of the background to how local authorities can ensure that the development of a scheme is effective. And local authorities are in charge of a lot of data. They've got an awful lot of data on their communities. And actually this is really useful in ensuring that you make the most effective scheme. Local authorities can understand the cumulative impacts of welfare reforms. And I think this is really important, because if you're creating some new support scheme, you want to make sure that the vulnerable people in your area are supported. And there will be overarching council policies around welfare support and around policy. Around poverty, sorry, and understanding in the first place the impact of welfare reform and future impacts can help you design a scheme that will fit in with your overarching policies. And the second point we've got on this slide about funding streams is also just as important. Local authorities have funding from various sources, and if you're designing a CTR scheme, you want to ensure that the funding covers all your most vulnerable households. So an impact assessment of your CTR scheme, your proposed schemes, allows you to see who will be heavily impacted and who will need support. And by looking at all your funding streams in the round, you can actually see if there are any gaps that people under the new CTR scheme where they won't be met by your existing funding. And this really helps inform, right at the beginning, before modelling starts, this really helps inform areas that you want to protect. So we would really advise most authorities that actually to get a very effective scheme, if you have an idea of overall funding from various streams and you have an overall idea of your welfare reform impact in your area, it can really help deliver a scheme that fits into your welfare support objectives for your area. A final point we've got here is that to recognise that people will always turn to local authorities when in difficulty. And I think this is really important. I think that people who worked in local authorities or with local authorities many years ago, when universal credit was first discussed, I think we imagined that what would happen is local authorities would move out of welfare support, that this would all move over to DWP. And it's very interesting that that hasn't happened. In fact, local authorities are finding a new role, their role in universal credit support, and holistic support for their communities is actually growing. But it means that local authorities are uniquely placed to offer support to their communities and those in need. So any council tax scheme can take all of that into account. We're going to just have another poll now, and this is actually interesting, is that when we've spoken to local authorities about the models that they're considering and the background to the development of their CTR modelling, most of them have got to the point where they discuss the schemes with us. There's been barriers along the way, and there have been all sorts of barriers. I think it's very interesting that Steve was saying it's the time that you're doing people are doing day jobs as well, and then trying to find time to do a very, very large exercise of looking at current position on welfare reform, current position on funding, how CTR models could fit into that, how they can fit into future welfare reform, how they can fit into universal credit. And that's an awful lot to ask of somebody who's doing a day job as well. So what we'd like to ask you now is, what is the biggest challenge you face when changing your CTR scheme? And for some of you who don't know when you're going to be changing the scheme, the 38% who don't know when this will be happening, it'd be really interesting if you can let us know what you envisage the biggest barrier being. I'll just pass over to Janet, who'll run that poll.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you very much. So as Zoe says, the poll is, what is your biggest challenge when you face when changing your CTRS scheme? And the answers for you to choose from: maintaining administration costs, designing scheme options in the time required, modelling complex schemes, member involvement, or stakeholder consultation. Thank you very much. I can see the votes coming in, making for some very interesting discussions. I shall just give a little bit more time for people to consider their answer. Lovely. Just a couple more seconds. It looks like people have voted. Thank you very much. I shall close the vote now and share the results with Zoe and Giovanni. Any comments on those responses?
Yeah, I think the modelling complex schemes is absolutely right. There's a lot of proprietary software out there that does basic modelling, and that can do simple things like band caps, capital limits. But actually, we found that when we do modelling for people, they tend to take a mixture of things that are modelled. Very similar to Steve's comments earlier, that they looked at various changes we've modelled and pulled these together. By modelling various changes separately, you can have an idea of the impact, each separate impact, and it then allows local authorities to pick and mix these. And you end up with quite complex changes. Some of the changes that local authorities are looking at to fit with universal credit around discounts, around banding, these are actually quite complex, and to get them to the level that offers protection of the groups that a particular authority wants to protect does require quite in-depth data analysis, because a lot of authorities are looking at banding schemes, but banding schemes do tend to have heavy impacts on households and households with children. But there are many things you can do within a banded scheme to mitigate that. But actually, that's a difficult levels of modelling, and it's Giovanni who does that. So I'll pass over to Giovanni because he does all that difficult side.
Yeah, I think I'll be probably touching upon each of these challenges in a bit of my presentation. So perhaps we can move on, Janet.
Okay, great.
I'm sure I'll touch upon each one of these.
Okay, thank you. Okay, over to Giovanni.
That's me. There you go. So yeah, after Steve and Zoe's very insightful presentation, I'll be speaking about how our work at Policy in Practice can help your organization meet and achieve their objectives when it comes to designing a new CTR scheme. And I'll kick things off with another poll. We would really be interested in getting your input and understanding what is your main objective when designing your CTR scheme. Thank you, Janet.
Great stuff. Thanks, Giovanni. You should see that that poll on screen there. So as Giovanni says, what is your main objective? Preparing for UC rollout, supporting vulnerable households, reducing the costs of your scheme, maintaining administration costs, or another that we haven't put up on the list there. Thank you very much, everybody, for voting. Lots of people voting. You'll be glad to know this is your last poll, but it's great to get the interaction. Thank you very much. Just a few more votes to come in. Perfect. Lovely. I shall close the poll now and share the screen. So this is the results. Giovanni.
Great. Yeah. So reducing cost of scheme seems to be the #1 objective for the majority of you, and I think that was reflected also and emerged from Steve's presentation, the need to meet the sort of certain required savings. And I would say it's probably this answer reflects also my personal experience being involved with modeling different options for CTRS for so many local authorities in the past year, and I think perhaps I can confidently say that our work at Policy in Practice really does help achieving your objectives in this sense. And I'm just going to go, fly through a couple of slides to show you how we're able to do that.
Great. Just so, if I can, sorry, Giovanni, I'll just close the poll, but if I can say that those 8% of people that had another objective, while Giovanni's talking through his next couple of slides, if you could tell us what those other objectives are, we'd be very curious and keen to hear. Thank you. Okay, Giovanni.
Great. So I think for every single project that we were brought in and that involved designing a new CTR option, we follow a well-defined process that is made up of 5 steps, and I must say it's been refined through different iterations we had with a number of different local authority clients in the past year and a half. The first key step is really to come to you, listen and understand what your objectives are, and at this stage, sometimes we also help clarifying your objective, and we found that really by nailing this first step, the chances of succeeding in pushing things through from the modeling through to implementation are much higher. So in the first kickoff meeting we'd have with you, we discuss and propose potential changes, and at this stage we also bring in the experience that we've gathered by working with so many local authorities, and we allow you to consider perhaps different options that have worked in other contexts while recognizing your objective and uniqueness of your context and situation. We then access your data your council tax and housing benefit data, which forms the backbone of our analysis. And I'll be spending a bit more time explaining really the power of this approach in the next slides. And we then present the finding in a comprehensive report, which it's really useful both for internal purposes within your team to really get a very clear understanding of the impact that each single option would have. But also it provides the evidence for to engage members and to provide the evidence they need to inform their decision, and also the evidence needed for stakeholder consultation. So I now want to spend a bit more time speaking about our methodological approach, which consists of taking your housing benefit and council tax data. We work with it in an anonymized way, sort of to comply with any data protection issue. And these data sets I call them a gold mine of information. And we combine this richness of information with a very powerful policy engine. So this tool, going back to the main challenge you face, the complexity of modeling the schemes, this tool allows to effectively to take into account any potential single change you'd like to consider within your proposed council tax scheme. And at the same time, the engine, the modeling tool, takes into account all changes to welfare policies that have already become effective and that will become effective in the future. Jana, if you can move to the next slide, please, just to give an overview of, as you can see here, a list of all the welfare reforms. So, for example, changes in the minimum wage and in the personal tax allowance that will be increasing in the next year will have an impact on the amount of council tax support that your residents will receive, and so will universal credit. And we're able to model all of these together to really overcome then one of the main challenges that Steve Carey put really well down in a quote. Jenna, in the next slide, please. When he said that I can't see whether the people being clobbered by the reduction in council tax support or under occupation are the same people that have been clobbered by other reforms. Well, our unique approach allows to overcome this challenge and provide a comprehensive picture. We then compare and present very neatly the different options to the current baseline scheme, and we compare the overall costs, the costs, and the potential savings, the estimated savings in terms of weekly amounts for each type of and each different breakup of households, and the information presented in this way is really useful, as I said, both for internal use and for engaging with members and stakeholder consultation. So the next couple of slides we have before we wrap up are just present some of the sort of real-life examples of how we've been able to help local authority achieve their objectives. I'm going to quickly present this one, and then I'll hand it back over to Zoe. So one of the most interesting projects I've worked with involved modeling 3 different options for CTR for 6 district councils in Leicestershire. These district councils came together with 3 main objectives. First of all, they wanted to start cooperating at the county level, so explore the opportunity of coordinating the changes in a harmonized way. And we helped them by gathering the data from all the 6 different councils and modeling the same options across all of them. They were there asked by the county, so the Leicestershire County Council, to identify savings from the pot of money that was devoted to council tax support. And we modeled 3 different options. That one would envisage lowering support to 80%, and then the second one to 70%, and finally an option that involved reducing the savings limit from 16,000 to 6,000, very much like in Tower Hamlets, and introducing a band cap. And finally, I think the most interesting objective was to show how the potential changes and cuts to support in council tax would affect households that were already affected by other changes in welfare policy. So we first of all identified which households were set to lose the most under each of the proposed schemes. And we're also able to combine that analysis with analysis of the cumulative impact of welfare reform at the household level. And this allowed the council to build an evidence-based case to argue that the combined losses of the national welfare reform policies and the proposed changes to the council tax scheme would make the collection of council tax harder. What that entails that perhaps this would offset the projected savings from reducing council tax support and have them arguing against sort of deep cuts in CTRS. Over to you, Zoe.
Thanks, Giovanni. Yeah, I've got a few more examples here of how we don't provide a one-size-fits-all, and actually the objectives of each authority can usually be met through the same data, but what we do with that data will be completely different. If we look at Bath and North East Somerset, they wanted modelling because they wanted to make very, very high levels of savings, and that was their primary goal. They had an idea that they would set up a discretionary support fund around council tax in a similar manner to the discretionary housing payments. So they're in an area, and actually this brings in an interesting point that we haven't discussed so far, is that the demographics of an area have a huge impact on outcomes of models. That one model, the same model in two different areas, can have very, very different levels of savings and levels of impact. In Bath, it's quite a wealthy population. There's quite a lot of jobs. There weren't an awful lot of the population of working age who were able to work, who were on low incomes. So a banded scheme which tend to have a high impact on households with children, wasn't really so problematic for them. We did mitigate the banded scheme by changing band limits for households with children. But actually they were setting up this discretionary fund to help people, those who needed additional support. They were also preparing for universal credit, and what we ended up with in the end was a couple of schemes that would have worked very well with universal credit. I think in the end we had four schemes for them that would have worked very well with universal credit. And they took two of these schemes that met their key objectives of the level of savings and providing enough to also have a discretionary pot. And those two went out to consultation. And the report we gave them contained all the data they required for consultation. So they didn't actually have to do a lot of the usual preparation you would have to do for consultation, because the data was contained within the report. And I can remember meeting with them, and they were very, very pleased that they actually could just lift some of that data to show different households how they would be impacted by the two models they decided to go forward and consult on. The next example I've got here is from Ashfield, and Ashfield had very different objectives. They were very concerned that welfare reform as a whole had had a heavy impact on certain members of their community, and they were also very concerned that when universal credit came in, this would have further impact on the same people. And they were developing anti-poverty strategies. They were also wanting a new CTR scheme that would work under universal credit. But they wanted to ensure that any CTR scheme didn't hit the same people who had been hit by previous welfare reforms. And one of the key objectives for Ashfield was to ensure savings were spread widely. They had a very different demographic. There are a lot of people on low incomes, working households, but still requiring quite a bit of support. So we ended up modelling we came up with 4 models working with Ashfield that met these objectives, where the NE impact was quite widespread, and we could show by household type, by tenure, how much these CTR models would impact their communities. And I think it's the big assistance to Ashfield was it allowed them to see that when their population moved over to universal credit, you could design a council tax scheme to ensure that the people who were losing under universal credit were not necessarily losing under council tax reduction scheme as well. And it's allowing them to plan their anti-poverty strategy for the next few years. A very quick overview on the next slide of some of just to show you the variety of objectives of local authorities that we've worked with. North Hertfordshire actually had an underspend, and they needed to accurately forecast the cost of CTRS, and we worked with them on that. Islington, they wanted to look at a variety of schemes, but they also required an equality impact assessment on those schemes. So that was an additional item we could introduce to the modelling for Islington. Plymouth, and I think they're here on this call, so they'll tell me if I'm wrong here, but with Plymouth, they urgently needed member approval for a scheme change. But on top of that, they had a major overarching policy at Plymouth on child poverty, and no scheme was going to have member support if it had a heavy impact on families with children. So the models looked at the impact on the households so that they could put all the data in front of the members. And at Leeds, they wanted to look at a scheme that encouraged engagement. And this goes along with the new role of local authorities in supporting people onto universal credit and through the universal credit process and managing universal credit claims. But in order to do that, you need engagement. Leeds City Council, one of the priorities they had for scheme design was to introduce some element of conditionality for engagement with the local authorities. This was just for JSA recipients, and this enabled them to actually support those people into work where possible. Just next slide has just got these are some of the authorities we've worked with on council tax reduction schemes, and I have to say that it's been very interesting for myself and for the other members of the team to actually develop models and actually see the impact of the models, and we've now got a really good understanding of certain types of model and the impact they will have. But as I mentioned earlier, that unless you actually apply those to your area, to a particular area, the impact can be very different to another authority. So it's been really interesting for us. In summary, I just want to go through some of the key features that your data that you actually, you hold this data. You've got the SHIBI data, you've got the CTR data, and we can use that data to provide all sorts of information that will meet your objectives for your CTRS schemes. We can forecast expenditure. We can let you know what the expenditure would be if you kept your current scheme. If you just stayed as you are, we can let you know what it will be for various models. We can account for UC rollout and welfare reform. It might be that you just want to see how your current scheme would, the cost of your current scheme under UC, which means with the calculator, the engine that Giovanni discussed, we can model every single household as though they've moved from legacy benefits to universal credit, and then apply your current scheme to that income. So it allows you to see that if you didn't make changes, how much the schemes would be costing in the future. We can look at take-up of we can look at a take-up of council tax reduction schemes. There was initially when we started modelling, there was a worry amongst many authorities that if they made their schemes more generous or they made certain changes, this would result in higher take-up. I think we're now looking at the opposite to this, that we're finding local authorities that are going to full service UC are actually finding that council tax applications drop because claimants aren't needing to approach the local authority around housing benefit. So they're not considering council tax support. To most people on benefit, that's a very small level of support until it becomes a big debt on a bill. So there is a challenge to local authorities on how they're going to maintain take-up of council tax support in the future. And as universal credit rolls out to more areas and more areas move to full service, we're looking at data to be able to model that. Because it will have an impact. If there is a big drop-off in applications, we'll be wanting to model that as well, but we're still gathering data on that. We can always provide the breakdown on the effect of different types of households, so different economic situations, whether they're in work or not, whether they're on disability benefits, household size. We can provide quality impact assessments, breaking down the data by gender, by household size and by income. We can also match any other data that you have, if necessary, to include in an equality impact assessment that's outside CTRS and SHUBI. We can calculate admin costs, and this is useful, especially if you're looking to a scheme that aligns with universal credit. If your key objective is to save costs in the future, I think it's really worth considering reducing administration costs. Because the housing, the assessment won't be done alongside housing benefit. It'll be standalone, and doing full assessments of comparing income to needs is a very costly process. If we can move beyond that on schemes, there are certainly savings to be made. And finally, some authorities have asked us to model the effect on arrears level. And this is based, we can undertake this based on payment patterns to date, but also using national data on cliff edges of payments and at what level people stop paying. So this can allow you to see the double savings that you can make, the savings that are initially indicated for a model can actually be realised. I think that's the end of what we've got to cover. I'll pass over to Janet now in case you have any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Zoe. Just before I pop into the questions, I have a comment from Emma at Plymouth, who says, absolutely right, Zoe. I'm assuming this is in relation to the importance of the Families First policy that you mentioned. And Emma says, and your modelling helped us to reassure members we had protected families. Sign-off is due at Council next week and has cross-party support now. So that's great news to hear. Thanks, Emma, for sharing that with us.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. That's really useful. It's always useful to know what happens to these reports afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. Just a couple of questions then. I'm very conscious of time. We're at 11:29 now, and we said we'd be on our way by 11:30. But if I could just, a couple of questions to add in there to yourself, Zoe or Giovanni, or both of you. How many of your clients end up implementing the scheme that you recommend?
I think we don't do a full follow-up. I mean, from what I know, most of them are taking forward at least a couple of the schemes, at least a consultation. They often don't use the schemes in their the models in their entirety. I think that for many, the most useful modelling we can do is 3 or 4 different types of scheme that have different impacts. And then the local authorities can pick bits. The local authority can pick bits of each of those schemes. And I've just been visiting the local authority and advised to hold back one of the models we were going to do for them, so that they could put the bits together that they actually thought they were going to go forward with. I think most of them come to us when they're actually sure they're going to be introducing a new scheme. So I'm not sure that they take the models through in their entirety, but for many, I don't think that's the exercise. I think the exercise is to have an understanding of the impact of various various changes, and they can then develop a model out of it, which we can then run. We can then show them the impact and the financial and the admin and the arrears impact of. And Giovanni?
Yeah, I think I just want to add that often happens that local authorities end up implementing a hybrid scheme, so they would integrate different components of different options that we modeled into one single scheme.
Great. Last question then, if I may. How quickly can you provide scheme options?
Yeah, I think I think the pace of delivery is probably one of our strongest selling point, and we are, once we have agreed the schemes and the options that a local authority would like to explore, and we get hold of the data, we're able to turn around the analysis with a comprehensive report within 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes it happened under extraordinary circumstances, as explained by Steve at Tower Hamlets. The turnaround was even faster, and so yeah, we always try to help a local authority meeting their internal deadlines whenever it's possible, and I think we're quite good at that.
Great. And finally, have you helped any clients with their consultations?
We haven't written the consultation document, but at the initial meetings, they can specify how they like to go out to consultations and the levels of data they wish to include in their consultations. I do know at Bath it was actually important certain data included in the report that they could just move straight into their consultation document. I know local authorities will have their own method of consultation and their own idea of what sort of data they want to include. If they mention this to us at the very beginning, we can save an awful lot of time further down the line by actually providing the breakdown of that data for them.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Now, I'm very conscious we're out of time. Thank you very much for everybody that's posted questions already. If you have any more, please do let me know. Like I said with Steve, we can get the answers to you offline. That's absolutely no problem. This is one of our favourite slides. I shall leave, as we wrap up, I'll leave this with you. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Feel free to share that as you wish. In terms of next steps from today's webinar, please do, in the right-hand panel there, you may see that there is the opportunity to download a handout. If I could point you to that, that is our marketing literature, our flyer that explains the service that Giovanni and Zoe talked through today. For you to share with colleagues. Immediately after I close this webinar, there'll be a very short 4-question feedback survey. We'd love to get your feedback in terms of improvement, and also if there's anything else that you want to know about the stuff that we've talked about today, that's your chance to put some questions to us. And also, probably most importantly perhaps, is for the ability for you to request existing client reports. Zoe and Giovanni talked a lot about different work that we've done for different clients. We do have permission from some clients to share their reports with other local authorities who may be similar in structure, demographics or strategic vision. So we wouldn't share without their permission. We have got permission from some clients. So if you're interested in those reports, please do let me know. So without further ado, it's up to me now to say thank you very much to our speakers, Zoe Charlesworth, Giovanni Tenuti from Policy and Practice, and of course earlier Steve Hill from Tower Hamlets. These are the email addresses and also of the speakers, and also our generic email address at policyandpractice.co.uk as well. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been my pleasure to host this webinar today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next webinar very soon. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.